We're going to install double speed crystal on this HP 200LX. We need broad tip soldering iron, and I also have a fine tip soldering iron. I use a Metcal iron since it's very good for these small delicate projects. We're going to start by removing the crystal by heating up the area by the can. I'm going to use the broad tip so that we can minimize the amount of time that we have the iron on the circuit board for, and then we'll take care of the leads afterwards. So on the back side of this can, you can see the solder wick, soldered wicked up to the edge of it. So what we'll do here is we'll just touch the back side of the iron after it heats up. Clean the iron tip, and then I'm just going to prime it just a little tiny bit so we have some ability to wick the solder away. I'm lifting it up, so now that's separated from the board, and then we're going to go to the back side with the fine tip iron and take the leads off. I have some pliers here with some tape on them so that I don't get burned. I'm missing my pad for the Metcal. All right, now we've switched to this fine tip iron. Again, I'm gonna tin the tip just a little bit. I'm gonna go to the back side here. You need to be very careful. There's a capacitor here, and there's some small chip resistors here. The two leads that you need to unsolder are these guys right here and here. So I would grab onto the actual can of the resistor and then slowly heat up both of these guys on the back side, and I've just pulled it through. Now you'll see that these two through holes here, the vias, have solder in them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a little bit more solder. This is a technique to get the solder out using a solder pult. So now I've filled both those holes. Grab your solder pult. Just works by suctioning. So there's this hole. I'm going to put that over the top of one of the holes and use the iron on the back side of it. So here I just take the iron, my hand, I'm putting there, heating it up, and on the back side I'm just sucking out the solder, and we should have a nice through hole there. If we don't, we can do it one more time. Try heating it up from the top this time and pulling it through. That time we got an actual hole through. And do the same thing for the other hole. I'm just going to do from the top so that you can see it. Oops. Gotta prime the There we go. So we got two nice holes there to put the new crystal on resonator. So doesn't matter, there's no polarity on this. These two are the legs, and then the can is used to just ground it. So this one you can see is a 32 megahertz. So we're going to put the leads in the hole from the front side. We still have a little bit of solder in this one hole. Let's take care of that real quick. All right, now we should be able to slide this through. Try it with some solder wick here. This one's a little finicky. On these older boards, you don't want to try to minimize how much time you're putting the iron on the pads so you don't lift the pad off the board. All right, hopefully that's nice and clean now so that I can get this thing installed. All right, I'm gonna abandon trying to do it that way. I'm just gonna heat up the solder from the backside for the one hole and push the leads through. So I have it kind of pushed through both of these with a little bit of pressure, and I'll just touch the backside of the board. All right, so we have the leads in there slightly, but we want to make sure the end of this can is lined up with this. So we need to fold this over a little bit, and we can kink the leads to a certain spot, and then we know that that's where it needs to be. So we'll push this can down through again some more, and that's lined up where we want to be able to put it. So I'll go ahead and I'll solder these two from the back side. I'm just gonna touch the via and the lead, and then we drag up. So we just went and dragged up. Same thing with this side. Nice and melted, then we drag up. And we'll trim those afterwards so you can see that they're nice and shiny. Means we don't have a cold solder joint. And then on this other one, we need to switch back to that bigger tip so that we don't have to spend much time. So changing that guy out. I'm gonna prime the tip on here again, tin it. And then I'm just gonna push down with my finger. And you need to make sure that the can is hot as well. And not just the pad. So if you look at this now, I didn't really put the heat on the can very much. And you can see this solder joint is very dull. That means we have a cold solder joint. It might hold for a while, but if there's some vibration and any jarring, which this is a mobile device, so it'll definitely experience that, it might crack. So we want to really heat up both these things and take care of that. So I'm going to push this down with a screwdriver and let it sit. There we go. If you notice here on the back side, we want to make sure that these two leads are not touching. They're quite a ways away from each other, so we're all good there. All right, so now we're going to move on to adding this mezzanine connector so that we can add this double ram chip. This guy just has a very fine pitch header here. And when they build these boards, they put solder mask on them. So this board actually has a significant amount of solder on this header footprint that we need to use. So in order to actually solder this down correctly, the best thing to do is to remove the solder from these pads first. So we're going to do that with some solder wick. Right now I have the bigger tip installed, and that'll just help transfer the heat to this solder wick, and we'll just slide it along. So again, I'm going to tin solder iron, and then we're going to take this, and what I like to do is just take this, heat it up, and we're going to just drag. So we're just dragging. So now you notice that the solder wick has pulled away a lot of the solder, and we need to slide along the solder wick so that we don't have anything else. Now we've removed all the solder, and on that one side, I'm going to be very careful next to this memory chip. So we've just cleaned up those pads significantly. So you can see how the one side is basically completely flat, and then the other side you can see is still shiny. Those are raised, and if we try to install that header before we remove that, the chip will not, the header connector won't sit flat. So we really got to remove that. So Now that we've used that solder wick, we got to cut away this little portion of it. So we'll just cut that off. So now we got a fresh, a lot of times I like to kind of push solder wick open like this so it's able to wick more solder in one swipe. So again, we're going to start over here. Be careful not to touch any of the other stuff on the board. We're just going to drag along. Do the same thing. We're going to drag along. There we go. We got most of it. I got to get some off this last pad over here. It's right next to a transistor, so be careful there. And then we're going to get the rest of these guys. So now, before we go and solder down the connector, we're just going to look real quick to make sure that we haven't dragged any solder across these pads to create a short. And we can clean those up just by kind of touching each one. This will pull away. The green portion is called solder mask, and that doesn't allow any solder to stick to it. When they manufacture these boards, they use a solder paste and a stencil to lay a small amount of solder paste on each one of these pads before they send it through a reflow oven. So now we're going to switch to the tiny tip that I have for fine soldering, and then we will tack down one single side of this connector. You can see here there's a bunch of small connectors. So what we'll do is we'll tack down one on the left side and one on the right side when we're flip it over on the other side here. So the way I like to do this is I actually put some solder on the pad first of one of the connectors pins, and we're going to use that one to kind of tack the connector in place. In this situation, I'm not going to use this big solder. That's very aggressive for how much we need to put on. So I have this ultra fine solder here. We're going to just take a little tiny bit and we're going to tin one single pad here. So now we just took all that solder off and now I've tinned one. And then I'm going to take this connector and I'm going to put it in place, and I'm going to use that single tinned pad to line up where I want this connector and tack it in place so that I can run along the rest of them without the connector moving. So try to get it right in the center. I know my finger's in the way here so you can't see, so I'll move it out. We'll use this. This is very fine pitched for manually soldering, but we'll definitely be able to do it. All right, getting that initial one lined up well will help us do all the rest of them. So if you see here, we actually need to shift this connector about a 0.5 millimeter that way. So I'm gonna just touch this pad here and kind of shift it with my fingers just a little bit. Just makes it easier when we're tinning the rest of them or soldering the rest of them down. Okay, so I moved it now. And now I can see that each one of the pins is lined up with the center of the pad. So what I'm going to do now is I soldered this one down. I'm going to come over here and solder this guy down over here next to that capacitor. That way we have kind of a strong bond between both of the sides so that it doesn't move. It's hard to see what I did here, but basically what I'm doing is I start at the edge of the pad and I pull the soldering iron away, kind of wicks the solder away from the pad and gives you a nice finish on the pad. And then we're just going to go along and solder each one of the rest of these pads. next to this memory chip. It's very, very tight to solder these, so be very gentle. Try not to melt the plastic on the connector, but that's really a hard spot to get to, so just be patient while you're doing it. All right, we have all the ones by that memory chip done, and I'm just tacking each one of these down and kind of using the edge of the iron So if you notice what I'm doing, I'm pushing the solder onto the edge of the pin, and I'm putting the iron on the other side of the edge of the pin. That way I know the pin is hot. I'm not just jamming the solder onto the soldering iron. I'm actually waiting for the pin to be hot and the iron is on the opposite side. So we're not directly touching any solder to the iron. It's a good way to get a cold solder joint. So we're making sure that everything's hot and flowing so that we get a good solder joint here. So now I'm just going to walk back and touch up each one of these pins, and I'm pulling and dragging the solder off to the end. Get a nice joint here. And then afterwards we're going to clean this all up with some cleaner. This solder that I have does have rosin in it, so I'm sorry, it has flux in it. I don't think you really want to use rosin core on this stuff. Rosin core is more for plumbing applications where you need some acid up. I got way too much solder here, so I'm going to clean off my iron and just do a quick little stroke with this. It's a little tough, this one component is in the way, so I'm trying to go very vertical, but it doesn't give us much surface area for the connector to heat up. Got about 5 more pads here to do, and then we're gonna take a look at it and clean it up. Now initially when I did that first pin, I did not put much solder in. I just put enough to make it so that the thing could sit there without moving. So I'm just gonna come back here and touch it one more time with a little bit of solder. All right, so that's pretty good. Just gonna clean up some of these that I notice that we have a little bit too much solder on. These two right here next to this transistor and this capacitor, actually that might be a diode. Those two are a little tough to get to, so I'm just vertically getting it. All right, so now we've installed that mezzanine connector, and then this chip just sits on top like this. Press that in place, and then we're all set. The last thing that we need to do is actually trim off these 2 little leads that we came from the other side with the crystal. We'll trim those off, and then I don't touch them at all. Like some people like to remelt the solder over them, but I don't. So that's how you install the new crystal and the mezzanine connector for the RAM module. So hopefully you're able to watch this and see how to upgrade your HP 200LX.